Our last solving method is to solve a quadratic equation using what's called the quadratic formula. The two previous methods are somewhat limited. Our first method relies on our quadratic being able to factor, okay, but not all quadratic expressions can be factored. Our second relies on being able to have a very specific format with no x or all of your x's inside of a parentheses squared. So they're somewhat limited, but if you can use either of those two methods, those are generally the quickest way. Okay. A third way to solve is if we do a process called completing the square, which we're not going to cover in this class, but you may have covered it in your intermediate algebra course. If we complete the square on the general form of a quadratic equation, it leads us to a formula that gives the solutions to any quadratic equation. And this formula is called the quadratic formula. Okay? Be careful with quadratic equation. That's referring to the equation you're solving, and the quadratic formula is the tool you're using to solve it. Okay? So the quadratic formula says that the solutions of a quadratic equation in general form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, are given by opposite of b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, notice here I read this as opposite of b rather than negative b. Okay, reading it as opposite b is going to help you apply that formula better. Okay, so this formula can be used to solve any quadratic equation, but it's not always the quickest or easiest. Okay, simplifying can take up quite a bit of time on these problems. So if something factors, or you can use the square root property, generally that's the fastest way to solve a problem. Example 5, solve using the quadratic formula. So 5a, 2x squared minus 6x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, so keep in mind, in front of x squared is a, in front of x is b, and in front, your constant is c. So the quadratic formula, make sure you know that or have it on your note sheet for your quizzes and exams. Quadratic formula says your solutions for x will equal the opposite of b. b is negative 6, so opposite of that would be positive 6, plus and minus the square root of b squared, negative 6 squared, minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. Okay? Start simplifying that by putting the inside part of your square root into your calculator. Be very careful when you type it in. Make sure you use parentheses, negative 6 inside and then squared, otherwise your calculator will not do this negative correctly. So type it in your calculator just like you see it here. Okay, and if you do that, you should get 28 underneath the square root over 4. Okay, next you want to see if your square root simplifies. Okay, 28 is not a perfect square, so you next want to see, does it have any perfect square factors? 4 times 7 is 28. So what we want to do is think of the square root of 28 as the square root of 4 times the square root of 7. So if we think about it like that, then we have 6 plus and minus. The square root of 4 is 2. The square root of 7 is a never-ending decimal because it's not a perfect square and it doesn't simplify. So I can simplify the square root of 28 to 2 square root 7 all over 4. After you simplify your square root, then you can look at these three numbers and see if your fraction simplifies. 6, 2, and 4 are all divisible by 2, so we want to divide them by 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3, plus and minus. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and because there's still the square root 7 there, you don't have to say 1 square root 7, you can just say square root 7. All over 4 divided by 2 is 2. So there's your final simplified answer. What this plus and minus symbol is just expressing your two solutions in a compact way. For your homework, you'd want to type in a fraction, and in the numerator, type in 3 plus the square root of 7 over 2. And then as a second answer, just like we've been doing, 3 minus the square root of 7 over 2. So there's your two answers for this problem. Okay, example 5b, we have 2x squared plus 2x equals -1. In order to use the quadratic formula, we need all of our terms on the same side because it has to be in general form. So we would want to first add 1 to both sides. There's no terms that can be combined, but now it's in general form. 2x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 0. And remember, this is A, B, and C. Okay, so using the quadratic formula, our solutions for x will equal the opposite of b, -2, plus and minus the square root of b squared, which is 2 squared, minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. Start by simplifying underneath the square root. -2 plus and minus. You'll get -4 underneath your square root, all over 4. After you've got your first simplifying done, now you want to see, does your square root simplify? Well, 4 is a perfect square, so that will simplify. So this will equal -2 plus and minus. The square root of 4 is 2, and since there's a negative, the square root of a negative is I. So -2 plus and minus 2i over 4. And your last thing you should always do, once you've simplified your square root, look at this and this and this. See if there's a common factor that divides those. And there is. They're all divisible by 2. So -2 divided by 2 is -1. Plus and minus 2i divided by 2 is I. And 4 divided by 2 is 2. So our solutions, -1 plus I over 2, comma, -1 minus I over 2. Okay, and example 5c, 3x squared plus 5x minus 2 equals 0. So quadratic formula, our solutions for x equals opposite of b, -5, plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. So calculating underneath your square root, you're going to have 25 plus 24, which is 49, all over 6. Check and see if your square root simplifies. It does for this problem. The square root of 49 is 7, exactly. So no square root left on this one. And since there's no square root or I left, what I'd suggest you do at this point is split this up, 1 for the plus, 1 for the minus, and have -5 plus 7 over 6, and -5 minus 7 over 6. Solve those two separately. So this one, -5 plus 7 is 2 over 6, and 2/6 simplifies to 1/3. Okay, so either divide these both by 2, or on your calculator, 2 divided by 6, math menu, select fraction as the first choice. Okay, our second solution, -5 minus 7 is -12 over 6, and that divides to -2. So our solution set, two nice solutions on this one, 1/3 and -2.